Hey guys, it's ShadowFlyer. In one of my recent videos, I discussed a lot of what goes into the cost of getting your private pilot certificate and some tips on how to make it more affordable. Today, I want to jump into what you can expect during your training, going over some of the requirements, a general timeline of events, some different methods and schedules you might see, and recognizing some of the outliers and variables that can affect your training. Alright, so first things first, what do you need to get your private pilot certificate? Most prospective pilots have already Googled this multiple times, and it's very easy to get lost and overwhelmed with all the information you find. Whether you're watching this video now in 2020 or you're watching it in 2030, it's best to look at the original source to find the answer. You don't need to buy the whole FAR-AIM book. But if we just Google FAR 61, we're going to find exactly what we need. FAR 61 is the part that outlines the certification requirements for airmen. I'm going to use the edition provided by the Cornell Law School just because I like the layout better. But any of these top 4 links will suffice. If we scroll down to where it says private pilots, then we will be looking specifically at the requirements for getting the private pilot certificate, as you probably could have guessed. Most of this you won't really care about for right now. It's good information, but it'll primarily be up to your flight instructor to make sure you meet all of these requirements. The ones we're going to look at specifically are the eligibility requirements and aeronautical experience, or hour requirements. So these are the general requirements, which I highly recommend you read through. But I'm going to pull up, this is what I'm going to call my overly simplified version, and it pretty much says that you need to be 17, understand English, and have the required flight experience, and be able to, and pass both the knowledge and practical test. There's obviously a lot more to this, and it doesn't go into the medical requirements, and there are a lot of exceptions. But this is the important information for now. Your flight instructor and medical examiner will help you when the other stuff applies to you. Coming in your first lesson, you don't have to meet these requirements, though. This is just what you need at the time of your check ride. In fact, there's almost no requirements to take a flight lesson, if you're a U.S. citizen. You may want to check out, though, the student pilot certificates requirements, because you're going to need that to solo, which will happen well before you take your check ride to get your private. Now, getting into the meat and potatoes of this, aeronautical experience requirements. So backing out here, aeronautical experience. In terms of hour requirements, you will generally need everything you see here. Going back to my overly simplified version for single-engine airplane applicants, you will need at least 40 hours total flight time, 20 of which must be with an instructor and 10 of which must be by yourself. That leaves you an additional 10 hours to use however you see fit. An additional 10 hours solo would obviously be cheaper than dual, however, that will be between you and your instructor to decide. Within those 20 hours with an instructor, you'll need 3 hours of cross-country time, 3 hours at night involving at least 1 cross-country and 10 takeoffs and landings, and finally 3 hours pretending you can't see outside the cockpit. Then within your solo time, you'll need 5 hours on cross-countries, including a longer 150-mile cross-country, and 3 landings at an airport with an air traffic control tower. If you haven't started your flight training yet, there may be some terms and definitions here that you aren't familiar with. I promise that after a few lessons, you will have heard them enough times, you will know what they mean, and you'll be sick of hearing them at that point. But If you want to know beforehand, just copy and paste unfamiliar terms into Google. And while you might get sidetracked by a bunch of random videos on YouTube, it's a great habit to get into because there's a lot of good information out there. And taking the time to do your own research will better prepare you for the time you spend at the airport. To take things one step further, I'd like to point out that we've just looked at the regulations governing Part 61 flight instruction. If you're willing to pay more money and go somewhere more structured, you can attend a Part 141 flight school. To look at their rules, we can either Google Part 141, or if we click here, go back and exit for Part 61, we can go to Part 141 under schools. Now, just like in Part 61, we will click on the private pilot course, and it will show us the requirements just like before. There is a lot of information here, and most of it doesn't apply to you if you're trying to fly an airplane. In fact, if you're going to read through this, you will find that a lot of the information is very similar to Part 61 in terms of hour requirements. It's mostly just taking off the 5 hours of solo cross-country time. That leaves you with only 35 hours needed total, and only 5 hours of solo time needed. Technically, that still means you'd have 10 hours to either be solo or have dual lessons, but most schools are going to have plans to use this time with the instructor, so it's not exactly an option per se. Alright, so now that you know the basics of what the hour requirements are, let's briefly discuss the common timeline and some different schedules you might find. In general, you start off with the very basic lessons teaching how to fly straight, make turns, climb, descend, etc. Once you progress and show that you have the ability to land the plane safely without scaring your instructor half to death, you'll get your student pilot certificate and you'll get to do your first solo flight. From there, you'll continue working on your flight skills, start working on flying from one place to another, learning how to navigate and how to go places you're unfamiliar with. Once you complete all the hour requirements and your instructor feels confident in both your knowledge and your ability to apply the knowledge, he or she will sign you off to take the check ride, the actual flight test. This is a very, very broad timeline, and it skips over a lot of important things for a reason. This is the normal schedule you can expect to see most places. You will see a lot of variation with the other stuff, and even some of the stuff I mentioned. For example, in my timeline, I put your expected solo flight pretty early on. But when you solo is going to be based off of you, your instructor, and your school. The school schedule usually comes first, followed by your instructor's preference, and then followed by your readiness. Some schools and flight instructors make you solo very late in training for safety reasons. In fact, it may be one of the last things you do before you take your check ride. I've also met instructors on the opposite end of the spectrum that want you to solo having only had a couple lessons. And I could talk all day about my preferences and opinions on this, but the idea here is that when you solo can vary a lot. Another huge variation in the schedule is when you spend the time to perfect your flight maneuvers and landings. I personally like to spend a fair amount of time working on this before the student solos. That way, when they do solo, they can work on it by themselves, and then they can come back to me to kind of get those finishing touches. But other schools might have you initially practice before solo, and they don't have you spending a lot of time actually working on them until closer to your check ride, just because they don't want you to lose your skill while you're waiting or while you're doing cross countries and stuff. And finally, a smaller variation in your schedule will be when you get your flight medical and finish your written test. You need to get your medical before you solo, and if there's any chance that you could be disqualified over a pre-existing condition that you know of, You should seriously consider getting it done before you even start flight training, because if something comes up, or even if it's not your fault and it's just a matter of the medical examiner is just busy, you can't solo without that. And if you can't solo, you can't do a lot of other things. So it can ultimately push back your timeline if you push this off, or worse, if you go in for your medical and something comes up that you weren't expecting. Your written test, on the other hand, is much more flexible. You don't need to take your written test until you're about to take your check ride. But that doesn't mean you should just push it off till the last minute. If you're going to go through an accelerated course, you may even have to take your knowledge test before you ever step into a plane. If you're not in an accelerated program, both 61 and 141 lessons prior to cross-country flights tend to be pretty heavy on the knowledge side. And for all you newcomers, a cross-country is not a flight across the country. It's just over 50 miles. So if you've never taken a flight lesson, sometimes that term can be confusing. It's just a 50-mile flight. It's not nearly as long as a lot of people think. But anyways, by the time you're planning your first cross-country, you should be more than ready for your written test. And if you're doing most of your learning at home by yourself, you should be ready even earlier than that. I personally recommend using a self-study guide like Gleim to prepare for your test. Even if your instructor is teaching you everything you need to know, self-study courses can tremendously help in preparation for your test. So now that we've discussed the general timeline and some common variables, we've got to call out some of the outliers that aren't planned, but can also affect your schedule. The big three would probably be scheduling issues due to plane availability, instructor availability, or the lack thereof. Delays due to weather or unforecasted life events. And then 3, your personal ability. I talked about these in my last video, but I always recommend planning for a little bit of Murphy's Law. Things rarely go the way we plan, and usually things pop up. Big, small, whatever it is, they cause us to have to change our schedule and kind of replan what we're doing. So if you account for a little bit of Murphy's Law ahead of time, when things pop up, you have to miss a lesson or two due to weather, low clouds, a last minute work thing that pops up, or a maintenance issue. If you plan for it in advance, that won't have to push back your check ride goal. However, if you get too relaxed, or you aren't studying at home, you don't come prepared to your flight lessons like repeatedly, your instructor will not feel comfortable signing you off to solo, signing you off to cross country, and definitely not to take your check ride. So a lot of things can change our lives, but the greatest factor is always how we act and how we react to the things that come up. So don't make yourself a hindrance to your flight training. So that's all I have for today. If you have any questions about getting your private pilot certificate, please reach out in the comments, and if it's a big enough question, I might just make a whole nother video about it. So as always, feel free to like and subscribe. Have a great day, guys.